In this lesson, we look at some more advanced types of equations, and the ones that we're going to look at in this lesson have to do with absolute value equations. And an absolute value equation is simply an equation that contains an absolute value. So if you don't remember what an absolute value is, I'll give you a little crash course. The answer to this expression right here is 2 or -2. Because absolute value is related to your distance from 0. So the distance from 2 is 2, and the distance from -2 is also 2. So that's a little crash course on absolute value. If you want some more detailed explanations, see me during class. But we're going to look at some more complex ones, such as where we have an expression inside the absolute value, or we have a very complex expression inside the absolute value, plus we have maybe a coefficient or something being added. And you can solve these types of equations by solving two related linear equations. Since there are two answers to an absolute value equation, there are two equations that you're going to need to solve. So let's look at what the equations are. When you're solving an absolute value equation, you take the expression and you set it equal to the number or the inverse of the number. So for example, very simply over here, I said x equals this number right here, or x equaled the opposite of this number. So those are the two equations that we're going to create. So let's look at our first one. X minus 4 in absolute value is equal to 6. So the two equations that I'm going to solve are x minus 4 equals 6 or x minus 4 equals -6. So I have to solve both of those because absolute value has two answers. So if I solve this one, I add 4 on both sides and I get x equals 10. If I solve this one, the process is the same of adding 4, but I get -2. So the two solutions are 10 or -2. You don't know which one because you don't know whether it's +6 or -6 inside of here. But if you plug in 10, you'll get absolute value of 6. And if you plug in -2, you get the absolute value of -6. All right, now when you're solving absolute value equations, what you have to realize is that the absolute value of a number is always positive. So when the absolute value symbol is by itself, it can't equal a -5. The number inside could be -5, but when you take the absolute value, you won't get -5. You'll get a positive answer. So this is an example of a no solution. So you can't just without thinking, solve your two equations. This one has no solution because you can't have a negative number when you're done doing your absolute value. Now, I want to point out that I wouldn't necessarily go ahead and do that up here because there's this 3 involved. So we'll look at equations where you have to get rid of the 3. But when the absolute value is totally by itself, then you can say if it's negative, then there's no solution. Like if this 3 didn't exist, then the absolute value is by itself. But since it's not by itself, then you have to get rid of the 3. All right, so here's an example of that. I can't necessarily assume that this has no solution because it equals a negative number because there's this -10 there. So I have to get rid of that first. Then if it's still negative, then I say no solution. So I drop my line, I add 10, and you see now it equals a positive number. So now I can see that there is a solution. So you can't just automatically assume that it's no solution. So let's go through. Let's do our two equations. 3x plus 9 equals 6. 3x plus 9 equals -6. So the process is the same, but you end up with different answers. I'll subtract 9, and I'll get 3x equals -3. So one possible solution is x equals -1, or the other solution, -9, and that gives me negative 15. Divide by 3, the other answer is negative 5. So if you go in and plug in negative 1, you'll get a negative 4 when you do all your calculations. And if you plug in negative 5, you'll also get negative 4 when you do all your calculations. So those are the two answers. All right, I'd like to give you a try and have you practice on your own and see how you can do with these. Letter A, first you have to get rid of the 5. And in letter B, you have to get rid of the 3 and the negative 2. So that might be a little tricky, but I'd like you to pause the video and give them a shot on your own. When you think you have the answer, press play. All right, a couple things I want to point out in letter A and B. I just want to remind you that when you split up your equations over here at this step, you don't bring down the absolute value sign. Once you've split them, the absolute value goes away because you're solving the inner portion of the absolute value. You're not solving it with the symbol. So do not put the absolute value vertical lines when you get to this step. The other thing I want to point out is don't freak out if you get a decimal or a fraction, whatever. I wrote it as a fraction. I would prefer you to write it as a fraction, but if you wrote negative 0.6, that's fine. And again, you can check these by plugging them in and doing the calculations. I didn't, but I certainly would encourage you to if you want to check your work. If you have any questions, write them down and ask me when you come to class.